All right, it looks like we're in business here. We were having a little technological issue, and I don't have a 17-year-old in the room to help me. That's always a challenge. Randi, do we have you on the line?
I am here.
Excellent. Welcome. Just so you all know, Randi and I have known each other for many years, and I have the utmost respect for her. I'll give you a visual of Miss Randi, and there we are. Turnkey has worked with Randi at the Hydrocephalus Association for several years, and Randi is always intriguing to me because of her deep background. What she's going to talk to us today about and help us understand better is how, when your affected audience is very tiny, how do you work with that? Does it limit you in some fashion that maybe other organizations and missions are not limited by? Our goal in every case is to fill our track and or our stair or our bar or whatever venue it is we're running our peer-to-peer activity in, and we'll talk about whether being big or small has any impact on that. So, Randi, if you could tell us a little bit about your background at each of these organizations, that would be great.
I actually started my fundraising career many, many moons ago in academic fundraising at a college as director of the annual fund. Then I took a few years off to help raise my stepdaughters, and I was a volunteer for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and about the time I was sending my oldest stepdaughter to college and writing that tuition check, I thought, you know, I think I better go back to work, and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation was actually looking for a staff person, and so it just worked out that I got into the world of national nonprofit health organizations. So I was with CF for 8 years in upstate New York as their executive director. I joined Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation as their executive director for a year in upstate New York, and then they transferred me to Raleigh, North Carolina to open their first office in eastern North Carolina. That was just as JDRF was hitting their big growth spurt, and I was with JDRF for 8 years. I joined the March of Dimes as state director for North Carolina chapter and was with them for 5 years. And I am now the national director of special events at the Hydrocephalus Association and have been with them for 5 years. So the majority of my career has been spent in national health organization special event fundraising.
And so now, Randi, you are at the Hydrocephalus Association, which is characterized by some different things.
Very different.
Than your, yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I'd love to hear about that and what it means to you.
Okay. There's a lot of differences here, actually. For one thing, hydrocephalus is not a household word. Most people don't know what it is. For those of you who don't know, and I had to look it up when I interviewed for the job, hydrocephalus used to be called water on the brain. And it's really a case where the cerebral spinal fluid, which circulates throughout the brain, is blocked in some way, and it backs up. And the only way to treat it is with brain surgery by implanting the most common, implanting a shunt to drain the excess fluid. But it's not a household word. When I was with Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, you know, I could go into a CEO's office and say, diabetes impacts a lot of your employees. It impacts your health insurance premiums. It really is in your best interest to support this organization. Not so much with hydrocephalus. It is a lower number in the population. There's 1 million Americans with hydrocephalus. It's often misdiagnosed or not diagnosed. The most significant medical advance, the development of the shunt, was made in the 1950s, but unfortunately, there have not been any real significant research or better treatment methods since then. And the federal government has pretty much ignored hydrocephalus when it comes to research funding. Last year, the federal government spent $6 million on hydrocephalus research. So it's a very different situation than when I was with the March of Dimes, and of course they're old, big name. You know, 90% of Americans have heard of March of Dimes and think it's a good organization. Or when I was with Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, and the significant population that that affected. So Hydrocephalus Association has been a very different culture in many ways.
Randi, I think we're getting a little bit of bad reception on you. I don't know if you can, if you're on a cell, if you can move around a little bit to try and get us, or climb a tree, which is what we do in the country, you know, either way.
Okay.
But,
Let me try that. Okay.
All right. Very good. So, you know, the real question is, in spite of the small population, relatively small population, and in spite of the low commitment by the government with funding for research, and in spite of the low, I guess, name recognition of the condition itself, can you compete? You know, can you raise money as effectively as the big dogs? So, Randi, you had talked with me about what big looks like versus what little looks like.
Sure.
Tell me about the differences that you see.
Okay. You know, when I was with JDRF and March of Dimes, and even Cystic Fibrosis, you know, we had chapters in every medium and major size market in the country. We had paid staff. Now, the size of the events I was running for them, I still needed volunteer support, but you know, the staff was there working on fundraising events 40 hours a week or 80 hours a week, depending upon the staff person. And it was really a very staff-driven with volunteer support. You know, I needed volunteers to help with logistics, you know, a committee of 10 or 12, but primarily the volunteers were working on, you know, putting together walk teams, you know, selling tables for the gala, things like that.
Very good. And little, how does that look and smell and act differently?
Yeah, very, very different. Here at the Hydrocephalus Association, we do not have chapter offices. Our entire national staff consists of 10 people. And we have right now 36 volunteer-driven walk events across the country. And they are 100% volunteer-initiated and volunteer-coordinated. What we do is try to make their job as easy as possible. When I joined HA 5 years ago, we had about 18 walk sites that were raising about $400,000, but each one of those walk sites was out there reinventing the wheel. And the first thing I did was standardize everything as much as possible, always understanding that you're dealing with volunteers and you can't make them do anything. You can put things in place, you can encourage, you can motivate, you can cajole, you can plead, but you can't make them do anything. Because I'm a very big believer that volunteers are not unpaid staff, and you cannot treat them as such. So it really is a matter of giving the volunteers who are running our events as much support, as much training as they'll accept, and doing some of the bigger jobs for them. You know, we handle the incentive prize program for them. We handle the printing of the brochures and the posters. We put up their web page. We put up their Facebook page. I give them templates for things to post on their Facebook page. You know, we give them templates for opening ceremonies. As a matter of fact, we have a book of templates and samples that's about 300 pages. So they don't have to reinvent the wheel. But it's really, again, all volunteer-driven.
So what you're describing is a system where the infrastructure is there, where the bones of it are there, where a lot of the big decisions are made, but there's still space for the volunteer to be in leadership and to be creative without having interaction with the event completely absorb their life, because you've done the heavy lifting.
Exactly. I mean, all of the people that run walks for us most of them work outside the home full-time. They have families. Many of them either have hydrocephalus or have a child with hydrocephalus, and they have a whole other life. And, you know, they're not paid staff where this is their job, and they fit it in on nights and weekends and as they can. So it requires us to be very flexible in providing the support that they need.
Tell me, Randi, what do you do when you have a volunteer chairperson who failed? that you can see it coming a mile away, this person will not succeed. What do you do then?
Well, I have seen that happen, unfortunately. And, one of the things that you have to be careful of is how you goal a volunteer-driven event. One of the worst things that can happen is for a volunteer to work their fingers to the bone and not hit their goal. It's one thing for a staff person to not hit their goal, and we've all seen what that's like. But with the volunteer, they get discouraged and they will leave, and then you either lose the walk site entirely, or if you've been working with them on succession planning, maybe you can find someone else to pick it up. But then it's pretty much starting from scratch. When you see an event that is failing, I am on the phone with them trying to find out why, what can we do to help you, which is always our first question. How can we help you? And sometimes it just doesn't work. They're not a good fit. It's other things have taken over their lives, and it just doesn't always work.
How do you, you know they're going to fail. You've done everything you can to make them succeed, and yet you can see it happening. How do you fire them?
Very carefully.
Yeah.
I have fired volunteers during my career, but usually it's for something very egregious, or it's for, I had to fire somebody when I was at one of the big organizations, my logistics chair for my walk, which was a big walk, because other committee people were quitting because of him, because he was an absolute control freak. So, we plaqued him and thanked him for his service. But here
you plaqued him. You plaqued him and thanked him. I like that.
Well, yeah, we brought him to a board meeting. We gave him a plaque and thanked him for his service.
Love it. Love it. Love it.
It was sort of a tactful way of saying, here, thank you so much for the 8 years you've given us, and bye now.
Goodbye.
It had to
great.
be done. It had to be done, unfortunately.
Okay.
Here, really when we have the wrong fit, and I'll be honest, out of our 36 walks, we probably have 3 or 4 where we've got the wrong volunteer there. And sometimes you can't get those people out of there with a cannon. What you do try to do is recruit multiple co-chairs to prop them up and support them so that their role becomes less.
I like it. So what we're hearing, clearly I like dogs. What we're hearing is that the really big difference between a big organization and a small organization is that a small organization or a small affected audience may rely for capacity on volunteer leadership more than a large one. Would you agree with that? And that can help the, yeah. Now, in our conversation, she had said that is absolutely true, but that there are some requirements that have to be met in order for it to work. And the first one you talked about was marketing support.
Right. Again, these people are not professional fundraisers. They're not development professionals. And so we try and do as much of the more professional aspects as we can. And in order that everything is standard, because we do want all of our walks to sort of look alike, we do provide online printing services for them. So when they want to get their brochure for their walk site printed, they go to one of our 2 online printing vendors, they type in their local information, and they pick up their brochures the next day at a local print shop. The same thing with the posters. So, and again, we set up the web page for them so that they all look alike. We handle the Facebook page for them so they all look alike.
Nice. It sounds like you've conquered some battles on the front end that some of my clients are still working with. I have some clients who consolidated after the fact, meaning there are a lot of people out there, volunteers, who have created their own Facebook pages, their own websites, their own patterns of fundraising, and it's much more difficult to bring them into the fold and provide that service at a national level. Sounds like you guys have been proactive about it and gotten it in place. The second element that you talked about for success with a volunteer-driven organization, I wanted to answer a question as we moved to that. We had a question from the audience about the size of our event. Randy, correct me if I'm wrong, in 2013, you were at about 850,000 over how many walks?
In 2013, we had 32 walks, raising about 800 some thousand.
And, okay, and then in 2014, you went to 1.2 million with how many walks?
We had 35 walks, raising 1.5 million last year.
Okay, very good. So I think that's a good place to answer that question, because the second element of success was critical mass. So where do you think, in your organization, where was that critical mass that you needed to effect cost savings?
It's really interesting, because one of the things that I learned when I was coordinating big walks, and you know, my triangle, I'm in the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area of North Carolina. My triangle walk when I was at JDRF, or March of Dimes, was 6,000 walkers raising $850,000. That one single walk. And one of the things I learned from that experience is you get to a point where your expenses no longer increase proportionate to the increase in participants. That's when you can really start to lower that expense ratio. Now, our walks here at HA range in size from, you know, Wichita, which is struggling to hit 15,000 because of the size of the market, to our biggest walk is LA, raising 100, and she's probably going to hit 165 this year. And I was just at Long Island last weekend, and they're probably going to be about 110,000. But as the walks get bigger, that expense ratio does reduce, because you get to a point where you no longer need more tents, more tables, more chairs. The only expenses that increase, and I really think that it's when you get to about $75,000 and 750 participants, that's when those expense ratios start to stay pretty level. The only things that might increase would be the cost of incentive prizes, because you have more participants, and maybe, you know, depending upon if you're paying for food and things like that. But right. Yeah, you can get those expense ratios down by increasing revenue.
Very good. I love interactive audiences, and you guys are that. And so I have a couple of questions here. And I also want to apologize. It appears that both Randy and I are on a line that has some trouble. So Randy, you're not the only one breaking up a little bit. I am as well. We have a question from the audience that has to do with marketing support for awareness. And I'm just going to read it, if that's all right. You spoke of volunteers in social media and having to fire volunteers. Randy, what advice have you when a volunteer begins posting negative comments and false things, and even though we shut the individual down on Facebook, he just keeps coming up with new profiles and causing issues on volunteer social forums? Is there any experience or advice that you can offer when one bad apple tries to spoil the whole bunch? Boy, that's a good one.
Oh, it sure is, and I have experience with that, actually. One of the things that we did was we set up a private Facebook page only for our walk chairs, so that they could ask questions of each other. Our new chairs could seek, you know, advice from some of our more experienced chairs, so they could share excitement over getting a sponsor, so they could share disappointment over losing something. And we do have some chairs whose natural attitude is negative. And one of the unfortunate ways that some of these people use that private Facebook page is to whine, carp, and complain about HA and HA staff. Really, what I've had to do when it started to get to the point where they were feeding into each other too much and it was getting so negative, I had to call those people and say, listen, I need you to understand that our new walk chairs, our people who are just doing it for the first time, read those posts and they believe what you say. And I know that you're just venting, that you're frustrated with our software, you're frustrated with a staff person not being responsive enough, but you are you are coloring the way these people think about HA and this first-year experience. And you're making us sound like we don't care and we're incompetent, and we are neither. And, you know, if it doesn't stop, I'm going to set up a different Facebook page for the first-year chairs and let the experienced chairs whine, carp, and complain to their heart's content. Because I do know 9 times out of 10 they're just venting frustration.
Yeah. Very good. We have several questions, and I'm going to take them in order of how well they segue, but we're going to get to them all. The next question we have is, what's your committee structure, chairs, subcommittees, and how do you go about identifying and recruiting the right volunteer chair?
Oh, very good question. And this is something that my board does not really understand. And that is, I cannot go into a market cold and recruit someone. Honestly, the high standards we hold our chairs to, and I would put most of our walks up against any, you know, chapter staff-driven walk in the country, because we do hold them to very high standards. They have to come to us. They have to want to do it. So if somebody doesn't call me and say, hey, I want to start a walk in Buffalo, New York, we don't have a walk in Buffalo, New York. This is way too much of a commitment. It's way too much work unless somebody is absolutely passionate about doing it. And actually, probably out of every 20 calls I get, somebody inquiring about starting a walk in their community, maybe one of them will come through. I do have a prospective walk chairs kit that I send them that, quite honestly, is intended to discourage them. If they go through that and they come back and say, I still want to do it, I know I've got a good one, that they're going to be willing to put in the time and the energy and the commitment that it will take to do this event. But it's not the kind of job that I have been able to recruit for cold recruiting. It just doesn't work.
Interesting. When you get calls from people who want to help in some way, is it on your menu of opportunities?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting. One of the things that we do try to do is we try to not have walks too close to each other. You know, my rule of thumb is 2-hour drive or 100 miles between walk sites, because if they're too close together, I've discovered what you're doing is you're splitting the revenue, but you're doubling the expenses. And we have learned that people will drive to an HA walk because many of our areas don't have support groups, and it becomes the annual support group meeting. And we've had people, you know, most people are happy to drive 2 hours to an HA walk. We've had people drive from as far away as 7 hours to attend an HA walk.
Okay. I'm going to take a couple of different questions right now, and keep shooting them, folks. Who cares about the slide deck if you're getting what you need? What is your expense ratio nationwide? And I'll add on to that question, how do you define it? Meaning, what do you consider a direct expense versus an indirect expense?
Okay, good question. Obviously, you know, direct expenses, or what I call direct donor benefits, because that's what they were called at March of Dimes and JDRF, are those expenses that benefit the donor. So, you know, the easy definition of that is like the T-shirt. You know, you raised $75, you get the T-shirt, or the incentive prize program, or the venue for the site, which is a direct benefit to the participants. Our expense ratio, my goal is to get each walk site to that 9 to 11% magic number. That's the ideal for a walkathon anyway. Now, a gala, a golf tournaments can be 30 to 50%. A gala can be, you know, 25 to 35%. But where I was trained, the rule of thumb was walk expenses should be in that 9 to 11%. We are not there yet, to be really honest, because of the wide range of the size of our sites. And I think overall, nationwide, our expense ratio is about 20%. Some sites are in that 9 to 11, our larger sites, and some, especially new sites, the first 2 years, there's a lot of startup expenses. and they're probably more in that 18 to 20%. But again, we do understand we're dealing with volunteers, and you know, we have to. We know they're not going to get everything donated. They just can't. No staff person can get everything donated, as much as the general public might think that we do that.
Right. All right. We have a segue into T-shirts. What is the most effective T-shirt program you have seen, and why did it work so well, if it did work well?
Okay. Interesting. When at March of Dimes, at Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, you know, walkers who raised, well, when I started at JDRF, walkers who raised $50 got the T-shirt. Then a couple of years later, JDRF raised it to walkers raising $75 or more got the T-shirt. And then a couple of years after that, they raised it to $100. March of Dimes was $100, and then they raised it to $125. And last I heard, they're now at $200 to qualify for the T-shirt. When I joined HA, the walk sites that we had in place had a $25 registration fee, and people got the T-shirt. Well, that was the first thing I got rid of. I learned over the years the hard way, a registration fee will kill you. And because people will write a check for that amount, not raise additional money. And really, our walks, and any walk, really relies on those teams raising above and beyond. Interestingly enough, though, the average walker and how much they raise is so tied into the amount they have to raise to qualify for the T-shirt. I remember one time when March of Dimes raised the T-shirt to $150. The year before it had been $125, and I went down the list of 20,000 walk participants in North Carolina, and it was, you know, 125, 126, 126, 126, 127, and then when we raised it to 150, then it was 150, 151, 152. You know, that the amount that they are required to raise to qualify for the T-shirt is a direct proportion to the average donation per participant, or the amount they raise. Now, we have just raised the T-shirt to 75 here at HA, and it actually came from the veteran chairs themselves. When I came and I dropped the $25 registration fee, I almost got hung in effigy, but I did convince the walk chairs to make it $50 to qualify for the T-shirt. And we just raised it to 75 with very little backlash. But the way I'm explaining this to walk chairs is the reason that we want it to be 75, or if I had my druthers, it would be 100, is if it's a $25 registration fee, it's not that difficult for a family of four, for somebody to write a check for $100 and all four people get the T-shirt. When it's $100, there's very few families that are going to write a check for $400 for all four members of the family to get the T-shirt. And so it forces them to raise money from family and friends, which is what you want them to do. Because in trying to reach to that $400 level, they'll raise $700, $800, $1,000, $1,200. And that's when your walk money takes off.
So one of the reasons Randi and I love each other is because she says things like that she learns from experience, and then I get to go and find the science behind it. So I'm going to do something I rarely do, and I'm going to pull up a slide deck that, and forgive me, audience, but I think it's really important. And this is one of the reasons that I love Randi, is because she gives me things I can study. So forgive me for just a second. I'm going to find a different slide deck. Because, Randi, this is exactly what you're talking about. So the phenomena that Randi just described is what we call moving from a social to a market relationship. So Randi, when you got there and they had a registration fee for $25, basically they put a price on participation. So I want to show you a study. This is a daycare study. It was done in Israel with 10 daycares. It was a small chain of daycares. And they had a problem with late pickup. and about 25% of the parents were picking up their kids late, which, you know, incurs significant staff cost. And so they said, okay, what we'll do is we're going to put a fine on late pickup. And so they did. And what do you suppose happened when they put a fine on late pickup? Late pickup went up. And the reason it went up is because the fine turned into a price. So suddenly the daycare said, well, it's okay to pick up your kid late because we've told you how much it costs. That's inside their heads what was going on. And just like Randi pointed out, when they paid that reg fee, you said it's fine not to fundraise anymore. And Randi, you did a phenomenal thing, which you may not realize, because once you take someone into that market relationship and away from the social relationship, it's really hard to get them back. In the daycare study, they said, golly day, you know, our late pickups have skyrocketed instead of gone down, so let's get rid of the fee, and hopefully it'll go back to the heretofore just bad state instead of this now awful state that we have. But here's what happened. It went up again. And the reason it went up again is because they were in a market relationship. And now that the thing that they were buying was free, which was extended daycare, it went up even more. So the fact that you were able to rein that herd back in and get them off that market relationship and back into a social relationship is really phenomenal. Really phenomenal. All right, there's a slight diversion there. I apologize for that. I couldn't help myself. We're presenting on Thursday at the Peer-to-Peer Engage Conference, which is put on by the nonprofit Pro magazine, and that's part of that presentation. So it's a fascinating study, relates exactly to what you were talking about, and puts the science behind it, which Randi often lets me do, and we will share some of that later in this presentation. So I'm going to go back to our slide deck. Critical mass for cost savings. We've hit T-shirts. We've hit marketing support. We have one more marketing support question I was hoping that you would address, Randi, and that is, hang on just a moment. Wow, you have a lot of questions. Clearly, this group on this call, we need to get together for drinks, and lots of them. I can see that. So I'm just going to hit you with questions. Did you find out that there was a time when you felt like you had hit your ceiling in fundraising? Our organization seems to have hit a very frustrating 500K ceiling that we are trying to bust through, but that seems to have stagnated, that we have stagnated at for the last several years. What would you recommend? It's probably not enough information.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I'm going to be very honest with you. I have concerns because I know that our walk sites will top out because there's only so many hours any one person can give to doing this, and that when a walk chair has given it 100%, there really is nowhere else for it to go. One of the things that constrains us is finding the local hydrocephalus community. You know, we don't know who has hydrocephalus, and because there is no national registry, and if there was, they wouldn't share it with us anyway. And we try to work with local neurosurgeons, who are the people that treat people with hydrocephalus. And honestly, out of our 36 walks, there are only 2 places where the hospital will send a letter to all of their hydrocephalus patients announcing the event. So we know that we're being constrained by the lack of knowing who has hydrocephalus, and by the fact that these walk sites will top out. Now, one of the ways I'm trying to combat that is I am pushing our walk chairs like crazy to put together committees, because as I point out to them, every time they add someone to that committee, they are increasing their circles of influence. That, you know, they may not know someone who can donate water, but the next person that joins the committee may live next door to the Dasani distributor. And that's also important for succession planning, especially with volunteer-driven events. When you have a walk chair that steps down, and they do, you know, kids go to school, you know, they had young children and they were an at-home mom, and now they're going back to work because the kids are in school, or they have a child who's going through a lot of health issues, or, you know, they're just burned out, just plain burned out, we often lose the walk site totally because they don't have anyone to step up and take over. And so one of the things that we've been doing at our training meetings, and we bring all of our chairs in once a year, actually twice a year. We have our new chairs at one meeting and our experienced chairs at another, and we bring them in for training meetings at our expense. And one of the things we're doing with the established chairs is really focusing on, do you really want to see all of the blood, sweat, and tears you have poured into this event for the last 4 years go down the drain if you have to step down and the event is totally gone? You know, is that what you want? If not, you need to start thinking about increasing committees, using committees, because very honestly, and I can say this because I am one, the kind of people that are willing to do this are control freaks and perfectionists.
Okay, I'm going to pull you back into the slide because you were actually hitting something that we're going to go to, and I'd like to talk more deeply about it. So we really have hit this already, so I'm going to move on. Volunteer leaders is what you're just talking about, and you had described what you're getting ready to get into as the greatest barrier to your income, and I think that's really important. You didn't say, you know, the lack of an online platform or not a good enough one was your greatest barrier. You didn't say leadership support wasn't your biggest barrier. You didn't say even that a low incidence was your biggest barrier to income. You said my biggest barrier to income is the volunteer leader who won't expand the committee. Talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. When I first joined HA, we did have, like I said, we probably had 18 walks raising $400,000, and they'd all been out there doing it their own way. And one of the things I almost immediately insisted on was that every walk have at least 2 co-chairs. First of all, it protects the event. I ran into a situation very early on with a mother-daughter co-chairs, and the daughter had hydrocephalus, and the day of the walk, she was in the hospital needing brain surgery, and she literally had to throw her mother out of the hospital room saying, you have to go to the walk because there's no one else that knows everything that's supposed to happen. Not a good situation. And since a lot of our folks are parents, it's not that, it's not impossible. But trying to, and you know, I share with them committee structure charts, and we have job descriptions for all of the various committee roles, but it's hard, and they will tell you it's hard to recruit these people because they get the feeling, well, Mary will always do it. You know, I don't need to step up and help because Mary will always do it.
Got it. So in your mind,
yeah.
In your mind then, volunteer leadership is the single most important thing to growing income when you have limited budget and limited incidents, increasing organizational capacity. And I think one of the things that's interesting, our industry looks at volunteer leaders and they expect them to raise money, as in, it's, you know, being a volunteer leader is a marker to raising money. But I want to challenge that. I think it's something different. We're going to get into the data a little bit here. Randi was kind enough to give me one event, and she gave me the income from the event, along with each person who raised the money, and she gave me the committee list. And as you can see here, these are the committee members for one event, one small event, and how much of the percent of the total that these people raised. Now, granted, this is a very small sample set, and it's very difficult to get this type of data because even my largest and most sophisticated organizations don't track it this way. But Randi helped us see that on one small sample set. So here's the percent of the total raised by each committee member. And these are the teams on which reside a committee member and how much they raised. Again, this is an $11,000 event. So what we saw is that the individuals on the committee and volunteer leadership accounted for 15% of the event income, and the teams associated with committee members accounted for 24% of the event income. What I'm going to take you guys into now is the idea that serving in volunteer leadership is not a marker for high income, meaning, of course, as people are on the volunteer, they care deeply and they go fundraise. What I suggest to you is that it is causal, that serving on the committee will make you fundraise, and we'll talk about why. One of the things that Randi has figured out over her career, and quite literally, when I have a question, sometimes I'll just call her up, and she's gracious enough to talk to me about it. And then that helps me go back to social science and go back to data and figure out what's behind it. So examples like what she gave with the T-shirt and the registration piece, what they rely on are two types of motivation, and she identified that. One type of motivation is intrinsic. I do what I'm going to do because of the way I see myself. The other type of motivation is extrinsic. I want the T-shirt. I'm going to pay my reg fee in order to get it. I use an iPad because the iPad is the bane of my existence with my nonprofit clients. I think 1 out of 2 national nonprofits badly wants to give their $10,000 fundraisers an iPad, and I desperately don't want them to, because I know, like Randi, that an intrinsically motivated participant will raise more money and behave better than an extrinsically motivated one. So I'm going to go through some of these slides very quickly. Our job is to move people to here. Our job is to get people to see themselves doing behaviors that help them self-identify as committed to your mission. This bucket of people, the not committed and unaware, they don't exhibit any behaviors that have to do with anything about helping us, because they don't even know, for example, that hydrocephalus exists. Most of our missions are not quite that way. The not committed and are aware, these are people who have been sufficiently educated, but social science tells us that being sufficiently educated and even holding an attitude of, gosh, hydrocephalus is a terrible thing, will not compel you to fundraise. Social science also tells us that a low commitment, meaning I registered because my brother-in-law made me, I'm parking cars because, I got guilted into it, those people have a very low attachment to us and exhibit few behaviors that we can turn into high fundraising. This is our magic area, however. If marketing can get people to here, then our job is to understand their decision-making patterns enough to get them to here. And the example that Randi gave with that reg fee happens all the way along the continuum, because people make decisions the same way, no matter whether they're raising no money or they're raising a lot of money. They still make decisions the same way. And this is how they do it. Common or conventional wisdom tells us that if we educate people enough, they will take on a behavior. But the way the human brain works, it actually is backwards to that. A belief follows a behavior. And I use this image as, representative of my childhood, because my parents drug me to church 3 times a week, no matter what, and I didn't want to be there. But after 18 years of doing that, until I could escape to college, it instilled in me an idea. And my brain watched my body in action to the point that it had to create a narrative that made sense. And if it didn't, then I would experience cognitive dissonance. And the narrative that my brain came up with is, I'm a believer. Another way to say that is that there is a bias for consistency in human beings. Once we exhibit a behavior, we badly want to exhibit it again in an effort to be consistent in our behaviors. And this is a great example. This is an example of an activity that turned into a belief. Most of the people who did the Ice Bucket Challenge, they don't even know what Lou Gehrig's disease is. They were not attached to ALS, but they were inspired by having fun, showing off, being called out by a friend, and they exhibited the behavior for those reasons, and then their brains had to chase them down and catch up and make up a narrative about why that made sense. Why did I do that? Oh, it must be because I am connected to ALS. Subsequent to the majority of the online activity for Ice Bucket Challenge, ALS walk income with no investment beyond what they had already planned, walk income skyrocketed. It went up by 37%. And that was due to all those people in the community having this attachment that they'd seen their bodies exhibit a behavior, and their minds had to find a reason that made sense. And the reason was, I must support ALS. So these are the kinds of human biases that we can make use of, which leads us to volunteer leadership. And what Randy's describing to you is a way that putting someone in leadership will make them fundraise. If I'm passionate enough to come and park cars and take care of, picking up trash and recruiting teams and being an advocate and being chair, then I must be committed. I guess I better fundraise. I'm committed. So it is actually causal. Relay for Life I use as an example because that's where I saw it. I've been doing this for 27 years, which I hate to say out loud sometimes, but I have been. And I started with Relay for Life, and they were masterful at this. They put people in leadership. They put them on stage. They broadcast the fact that you were a chairperson, a voluntary chairperson. They made you business cards sometimes. They put shirts on you. They really got that if I can get you to be overt with your attachment to Relay, it's going to impact your behavior. You're going to fundraise. And Randy, would you say that you see that in your volunteer chairs?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that recognition is a huge part of that. It was interesting, the first year that I worked at HA, at the end of the walk season, I wrote handwritten thank you notes to all of the walk chairs, the volunteer walk chairs. And I must have had 6 of them call me and say, do you know that's the first time HA has ever thanked me for running a walk? I was floored because I come from a background where you can't thank everybody enough. Also, every other year we run a big HA conference, and I give out walk awards at the luncheon with everybody, all 600 attendees sitting in the audience, because I want people sitting in that audience to look at somebody get an award and say, I want to be there next time. I want to be receiving that award next time. And even though they will say, oh, I don't need public recognition, they eat it up with a spoon. Just like people will say, oh, the T-shirt's not important. Don't believe that for a minute. I still don't understand it, but people will walk on ground glass in their bare feet to get a free T-shirt, quote unquote. So there's a lot more that they do want that recognition. They do want that applause. Very important.
So intrinsic motivators, which is equal to recognition, can manifest in a lot of different ways. An intrinsic motivator is, as Randy said, standing somebody up and thanking them in public or in private. An intrinsic motivator can be an email message that calls out a positive behavior. An intrinsic motivator can be the act of being a volunteer leader. It's overt. It's out there. I see myself doing it over and over and over. And it reinforces my behavior. It triggers my bias for consistency. And if I'm on a team, there's even another bouquet of human biases that take place with social pressure, which is why team captains are so magic. So you use all these, and of course recognition gifts, putting it on their body and sending them into the community for a year is a powerful thing. The eyes on the branded product that you put on someone's body, the most important eyes are not other people. And for years I thought that those were the most important eyes, but they're not. Brand impressions only matter, in this case, to the person wearing the thing itself or using it, because that's a reinforcement of past behavior, which will make them inclined to continue that behavior in the future. So the results of those types of intrinsic motivators are high income, high retention, increased organizational capacity. I'm going to move into what Randy was talking about with recognition, and I'll tell one story too. As I said, I was a baby during the Relay for Life heyday, and I had one client who actually had a rule against, during any meeting, no staff person could take the microphone. Only volunteers could have a microphone, because they knew that that sort of self-labeling that happens when you're in front talking about your attachment to an organization was so powerful. And we'll look at some statistics now to see what that power looks like. This is a good client of ours, Melanoma Research Foundation. In their group, 2 times more fundraisers want recognition gifts than don't, meaning Randi is completely right. People do not survey accurately. We as human beings are terrible predictors of our own future behavior. In the moment, everybody wants a gift. So in this case, 66%. And the people who wanted an overt memento of their success raised 38% more money than did people who didn't. Interestingly, we expanded to include our entire database. We looked at every client we serve. We looked at every size of organization that we serve with this kind of program, and that number, 38%, held steady across millions of records, millions of individuals. And then we said, how can we look at, what can we study where there's a situation that everything is held constant except recognition? And we found one. The Alzheimer's Association has been our national client for several years, and they had one small group of chapters who said, you know what, we're not going to do that recognition thing. It's not that important. And so we studied them. It was pretty darn handy. And the vast majority were using recognition. They increased by 24% year over year. The people who did not use recognition, the only thing they did differently, had 34% less growth in fundraising and 24% less growth in participants. So it was a very nice, clean study that we were able to do. Extrinsic landmines in your world, they are really, really hard to avoid. And we call them landmines because, again, when you flip someone from a social or intrinsic relationship to a market or extrinsic relationship, you saw what happened at the Israeli daycare. The same thing can happen to you. Extrinsic landmines look like a registration fee. They look like, you know, when one of your great donors donates 2 tickets to the opera, or, you know, we're not less highbrow than that, 2 tickets on Southwest. You know, immediately people monetize those gifts in their brains. And when people monetize gifts that a nonprofit gives, they start to do some mental calculations. And they say, gosh, you know what, 2 tickets on Southwest, that's like $500 bucks. I spent, you know, 400 hours doing this. Is it worth it? They may not articulate it, but we know from social science research they're doing those calculations in their brains. I wanted to show you what Randi's program looks like, which is very simple. It's stuff you put in your hand or on your body because it's overt. And Randi, do you want to talk about this and its impact on your audience?
Sure. Honestly, and just going back to the landmines real quickly, I don't know if I ever told you this story, Katrina, but when I was with one of the big brand X's, they decided to try doing gift cards as the incentive prizes for the walk. And my chapter was one of the pilot projects to see how it would work. And at first I thought, well, this is kind of a cool thing because, you know, we can slide it in a number 10 envelope. It doesn't cost anything to ship it. Let me tell you, it was a nightmare. First of all, you know, quite frankly, in any incentive prize program, my rule of thumb is the incentive prize should cost about usually 5%, sometimes on a lower level I'll go up to 7 or 8% of what the person has to raise. But they don't need to know that. If somebody called me and asked me, I would tell them, but it's not something that we announce. But when you're getting a $15 gift card for raising $250, you don't need to be a mathematical genius to figure out what that percentage is. The other thing was they were all redeemed, and we actually had issues. We started to have to send them out registered mail because people would call us and say they hadn't gotten it, and there was no way to track whether it had been used or not, or whether somebody in the family had gotten to it and used it and hadn't told somebody else. I mean, it was, I would never do it again. So that's just my story about using gift cards.
Yeah.
But honestly, I want things with our name on it. I want things that are branded. I want things that people will see and feel proud of having earned. And I will tell you this, and this is coming from my 20-plus years of experience doing this, I don't care who it is. I've had multi-millionaires who could have bought a box car full of whatever the incentive prize was they qualified for. But by God, if they qualified for that prize, they wanted it. Now, they might tell their friends they didn't care about it. Oh, I don't care about the prize. It's the cause. Don't believe it. Really, don't believe it for a minute, because they're telling people what they think they should say. They want the prize, and they will come after it. So
Randi,
but ours is really simple. Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, raise $250, you get this. Raise $500, you get this or this. Raise $750, you get this or this. You know.
I love it. What we refer to that as at Turnkey is the item has to be of insufficient justification to do the fundraising in order to keep it from becoming a market relationship. So, as an example, if we had a Coach purse with the HA logo on it, that would not be a good gift because everybody knows what a Coach purse costs, and it's too extravagant. So that flips people into a market relationship, which is what we're trying to avoid. Randi, I'm going to move away from the slide deck because we're close to the end of our hour, and we invite everyone to stay. But I did want to get to a couple of questions that people had because they may have things scheduled otherwise. So I'm going to shoot them rapid fire at you if you can give succinct answers. Number one, how and when does HA distribute the T-shirts at the event itself? How do you manage sizes?
Yeah, we do. The only incentive prize we distribute at the event is the T-shirt because they want that instant gratification. So we ship we buy the T-shirts because we're getting the quantity of scale pricing, and we ship them to the local walk chair, who then takes them to a local screen printer to get the local sponsors put on the back, because we honestly, trying to deal with that would be a nightmare for us because, as you all know, local sponsors come in right up until almost a couple weeks before the event. And when people check in at registration, they get a ticket. If they have qualified for the T-shirt, they take it over to T-shirt distribution. They get their T-shirt, and they're happy. That's the only prize that we distribute at the walk, though.
Okay, back to marketing. Can you speak to the difference between your fundraising/sales strategies and how that works /ties into your marketing strategies? Give us an example of the sales strategy you put together and then how marketing supports that. So to translate that into more of the common language we use, your acquisition strategy versus your marketing strategy.
Okay. Interestingly enough, because we are so small, it wasn't until 2012 that we actually hired a director of communications, which was like one of the best things we ever did. She has really helped put together a marketing plan, which is something we never had. And she has, revised the web page so it looks more professional and done a lot of these great things for us. She's also a huge believer in social media, which has been a big help. But we're always, because we're so volunteer-driven, we have to teach the walk chairs how to sell this event. We can't do it for them. They have to provide the feet on the street.
So you're talking about peer-to-peer acquisition, and you're talking about marketing support nationally that increases awareness and credibility of the event. But what you're really doing is peer-to-peer acquisition with some support from email messaging and marketing, because I know we do that for you. Now, another question, do you ever encounter limitations on walk sites and the cost for those venues?
Oh, yeah, we sure do. Occasionally, because we're dealing with volunteers, we do have some volunteers who have run amok. We try and pull them back in. One of the things I'm starting to concentrate on, because I've only been here 5 years, I realized I couldn't teach them everything all at once because it would just overwhelm them. So we started with logistics and how to really pull together a well-run, professional-looking event. And now I am just now getting into expense ratios. And at the last veteran chairs meeting or experienced chairs meeting, we handed out every walk site's profit and loss statement so that they're starting to understand that the decisions they make have an impact on their bottom line. One of the things in nonprofit national health organizations, and it's just the way it is, and I've never agreed with it, but it is the way it is we're always dealing with gross numbers. The walk raised $100,000. Yeah, well, how much did it net? That's not a question that's usually asked, unless you're a chapter executive director, in which case the question's asked. But So I'm just trying to now get our walk chairs to understand the consequences of those decisions. We had one walk site which was very successful, but she insisted on doing it at the damn zoo, which cost us $10,000. And on a $63,000 gross, not acceptable, especially since, she insisted the zoo was the only place to do it, and, I knew that was baloney. They're obviously, everybody doesn't do their walks at the zoo.
I love it. Another question. We have tried the community walk model before and found that they were still too staff-driven. Volunteers too often look to staff to get it done whether logistics, fundraising, or promotion became difficult. How do you keep this from happening?
Yeah, well, one thing is we will train our people to death. I'm a big believer in not reinventing the wheel. That's why we have templates and samples for everything. That's why I give them this huge walk chairs manual to use as a resource. And I will be real honest, I had to do some fast talking with the board when I first proposed doing training meetings at HA's expense. And I had board members say, well, can't they pay for their own airfare? Can't they pay for their own hotel rooms? I said, no, I don't want to give anyone an excuse not to come. If we want them to do this our way, and we do, because we know that this will work, and it is an investment. Not everything is an expense. Some things are investments. And so in addition to our training meetings, which are a 3-day meeting, they come in Friday night and they leave Sunday at noon, we also do training conference calls. I am available pretty much 24/7 because I work from a home office to any of our walk chairs at any time, because they don't do this Monday through Friday 9 to 5. And we're just setting up a new staffing structure of account reps so that we're assigning each walk site to a specific person who will be their one go-to person. But, again, I always say this is your event. We can teach you how to do it, but we can't do it for you because we're not there. We're not physically there.
Well, Randy, we're at 12:04, so we'll let folks go. I will publish, with your permission, Randy, your email address to the group if they would like to reach out to you. And thank you so much. As always, you are a treasure trove of information. I love working with you, and I love talking with you about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Katrina. Thank you all.
Thank you. All right, everyone. You've seen a good example of what Turnkey does and a great example of a wonderful nonprofit employee. Any questions, reach out to me. We will pop you an email and wrap up. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.